About ready to tap out as I was with these frankly bloody awful manga tie-ins, I came across a title of two halves. SD Gundam Gaiden sent the chilliest of chills down my spine, and I considered deleting it from the list and feigning ignorance of its existence. However, the second part sparked a momentary memory in the back of my mind. From somewhere, I know the words Lacroix Heroes. I had to find out more. Blessedly, this game is nothing like its predecessor. Lacroix Heroes is an RPG, but with mechs instead of humans or elves or whatever. An intriguing concept for sure, and one that isn't particularly normal even by today's standards. You could argue that games like Nier Automata or Xenogears has elements of this, but in 1990 there was a real opportunity to strike out from the already established tropes and craft something truly unique. Unfortunately, rather than create an original story, all we find here is a bog-standard Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy Legend clone with robots instead of people. The people don't pilot the robots, as in every iteration of Gundam. No, the robots are the people. So all you get is a reskinned version of a game we've seen a million times before. The game is not balanced at all well. Its cliched yet still somehow minuscule story is padded out with one of the most obnoxious grinding mechanics you could imagine. You'll die a lot at level 1, not even being able to handle 2 monsters at a time. Even fighting one-on-one will leave you needing to retreat to an inn after virtually every battle. And that's the bonkers thing. You're not even fighting other robots. You'll still get the bats, the slime balls, the goblins, in a fantasy world no less. All the same old shit done better by so many other games. So not only was the Gundam IP shoehorned into a fantasy RPG, it wasn't even done to completion. Skip through the intro screen and you wouldn't even know you were playing a Gundam title. There are 1 or 2 passing references to the franchise, but other than that, this could be any of 1,000 other generic 8-bit RPG games. So, tap out I did. Sure, it looks decent enough, but I'm not struggling through the translation of a game that is so uninspired and laughably ripped off. If the developers and marketers behind Lacroix Heroes are allowed to be this lazy, then, goddammit, so am I. Nope, nothing exciting as I had hoped. Evidently I know the words Lacroix Heroes only from spending far too much time and money buying horrible Game Boy games, and nothing more. As far as Gundam games are concerned, I sigh and bow my head with the realization there is yet 2 still to go. Oh, I do so like a good history lesson. Penned as a history simulation game, Nobunagas Ambition is set in 1500 Sengoku-era feudal Japan. Literally the age of civil war, it's not necessarily a period that students of the Tudors and the Romans may be aware of, but a fascinating one it certainly is. Nobunaga was a powerful daimyo, a sort of noble or lord, whose ambition was to unite the whole of Japan towards the end of this feudal period of Japanese history. Up until this point, the Emperor of Japan was little more than a ceremonial leader, with the land being broken up into warring shogunates, not dissimilar to Saxon Age Britain or the city-states of early modern Italy. It's not my job to attempt to sum up large swathes of human history in one paragraph though. I encourage you to read up on it yourself. In the game, you control a daimyo of your choice to try to unite the whole of Japan under one rule: yours. This is done by allocating resources adequately to raise your military force, while also maintaining a productive economy by protecting the people. The game takes place in a turn-based manner, with each turn in the map view corresponding to a season in-game, and each turn in battle corresponding to a day. Keeping a successful state is only a part of the task, of course. Once your military force is strong enough, you're going to want to be aggressive to your neighbours. It's no good waiting for them to peter themselves out, because it won't happen. If you want to unite Japan, you're going to have to do it by force. In battle, you can defeat the enemy in a number of ways: straight up destruction of their armies, forcing a retreat, or outlasting them. When not in battle, you can send your samurai, a kind of second in command, into other fiefdoms to scout or spy. You can steal resources or even peasants from other daimyo, expand your cities, or even create non-aggression pacts and inter-regional marriages between states. There's a hell of a lot going on, and without the manual, you're going to be very confused. At the end of the day though, it's a conquer-all ambition Nobunaga had, so if in doubt, train your armies up. If you treat your land and its people as a soldier factory, the game becomes more winnable. The biggest stumbling block that the Game Boy version has is its inaccessible navigation. Knowing how to interpret the assortment of letters and numbers on the screen is a challenge in and of itself. Clearly this suffers from the kanji to English translation squeeze that we've seen before. If you thought the main operation screen was complex, wait until a battle is initiated. You have a plethora of options at your disposal: how many soldiers to send and how much food to give them, how many of your samurai to lead them, and which legions they command. And then it's on to the most confusing game of chess you ever played. The battlefield is laid out in a hexagonal grid, meaning you can move your soldiers to any one of 6 adjacent tiles. If opposing forces are adjacent to each other, they can battle or flee, or attempt to bribe each other. What makes this really confusing at first is differentiating between your and your enemy's forces. The symbols representing both armies, and their various cavalry, rifles and so on, are identical, aside from the fact that one side faces the left-hand side of the screen and the other faces right. If you do manage to work out which characters are yours to maneuver, there's so much flicking between options and menus that it can be a damn challenge to know what you're even doing with them. The music in the game is well composed and has a solid RPG feel to it. It doesn't get irritating, which can only be a good thing. Graphically, it's a little cramped, although seeing as there are few moving parts, it's never blurry, and as you'll be taking your sweet time doing anything in Nobunaga's Ambition, this shouldn't be a problem. This is a very thoroughly thought out game, but like old tabletops such as Dungeons & Dragons, it's almost inaccessible to new players. It should definitely not be your first game of this genre. Get something like the brilliant Advance Wars for Game Boy Advance, or one of the multitudes of great turn-based strategy games available on the DS such as Locke's Quest. These have in-game tutorials for a few levels, where some wizard or otherwise know-it-all guides you through the first few stages. This one has none of that. If you're going to buy Nobunaga's Ambition, and if you're a strategy game aficionado, I wouldn't recommend against it by any means. Make sure it has the manual with it, and learn it off by heart, because else you're going to be looking at that thing more than you're looking at your Game Boy. A Japanese exclusive, Astrorabi has a certain uniqueness to it. The levels are seen from a pseudo 3D top-down perspective, where jumping has the illusion of making your character jump out of the screen instead of upwards. At first, your character only jumps a little bit, but the height and length can be upgraded. Throughout the stages are these question mark blocks that look exactly like the ones out of Mario, except this time you're not jumping up from underneath, you need to jump on them. Doing so will reveal one of a few things, which can then be jumped on again to collect the various effects. Landing on one a second time removes the block, however, leaving a pitfall that sends Rabi drifting off into the great unknown. The reason this is important is because these levels are cyclical, repeating themselves until you find the special part in one of the question blocks. You better get used to how far you can jump, as pre-planning and methodical routing is necessary to search as many of the blocks as possible. Of course, you could find the power-up piece, in the shape of a heart, in the first one you look in. That's the luck of RNG. However, some of these levels have a lot of blocks to open. The other effects you can find don't always help either. Sure, there are exclamation points which give bonuses, and time extensions, I should remark on the stringent time limit here. But later on you'll find a lot of skulls, which, if you land on them a second time, decrease your score. Running out of blocks is a real pain, and this will happen with only a couple of circuits. There's also a small scattering of enemies that you can shoot, but I probably wouldn't focus too much on that until later on, as it really isn't a large facet at first. Whereas on the latter stages, you can shoot these enemies that grow out of the ground in order to get some jump and weapon upgrades. The game looks pretty nice, actually. The jumping animation of your sprite is effective in giving the game depth, and this is one of the few Game Boy games set in space that I can think of that actually has blackness as the space. Often this was avoided due to the excessive blurring. The music is too repetitive for my tastes though, and doesn't really match the spacey atmosphere. After 2 successful scrolling levels, there'll be a still level where you have a load of blocks that all produce a particular tone when jumped on. There are pairs of tones, and the aim is to bounce from one tone to its partner, eliminating all pairs in a match-up fashion. You don't lose anything for just letting the level play out, but the bonuses are nice. Overall, Astrorabi is accessible, if a tad repetitious, and looks great. I'd give it a go if you're after something that is unusual within Japan, virtually unknown without. You should be able to get to the ending, but if not, I'll detail it for you. I'm not spoiling anything, really. There's no final encounter or anything, rather merely a text screen that says, word for word, "At last, Rabi could take all of the power-up parts back from the Tortoise troops. Luckily, his efforts in the battle could make himself fly power-up parts." Then Rabi and the Doc are reunited. A somewhat baffling little title. I wonder who thought Palamedes was a niche waiting to be filled. In the category of "do we really need this" is another attempt at a Tetris-style falling block puzzle game. Where Quarth and Dr. Mario are examples of how to do it pretty well, this is anything but. Also released on consoles and as an arcade game around the same time, this version of Palamedes is probably closest to the Famicom one. It's a simple concept in which you have a die in your hand, and there are other dice descending from the top of the screen, which stack up and get closer to you. Reach you, and that's it. You've seen these sorts of games before, but the gimmick here is that you need to match the number on the dice to eliminate them. Pressing the B button cycles through the numbers 1 to 6, and pressing A shoots the die. The difficulty lies in the rate of progression of those other dice. They come at you so quickly that quite often you can't cycle through to the desired number quickly enough, and because to go from say a 6 to a 5, you need to press the button 6 times, it's easy to overshoot and have to go round again. There is to help you a row of dice underneath the one that you're playing. When you clear out a pair, you're given a die of that number. If you manage to accumulate more than one of the same number, you can automatically clear out some rows by pressing the down arrow. This helps for a few seconds, but it's really hard to do intentionally as the game is so quick. Stopping even for a split second is a big no-no. You need to use the dice in your hand all the time, so just keep jamming down if it's getting intense. Well, it's intense right from the start. Because you don't lose anything if you have no hand to play. Basically, go off instinct, don't think at all. It's the silly pace at which the game moves that makes any sort of strategy attempt pointless. There's no way you can look at your die or your hand, then at the board, then make a decision, and then cycle through the numbers in time. Do all that, and you're pretty much at the point where it's game over anyway. A difficulty curve would not have been too hard to program. Look at how Tetris or Dr. Mario start slowly and build up speed. Is that too much to ask? The game suffers too from an inhibitive shading on the dice, which can really hinder your gameplay. Games like this obviously benefit from having a colour scheme. I can't help but feel the devs could have done something more to help you quickly identify what block you're playing with. Some pips on a die face are not easy enough to distinguish. Some sort of pattern or shape would have been better. The game also would have benefited from better sound. The music is kind of irritating. You know what? All aspects of the game are just slightly on the wrong side of okay, and this makes Palamedes wholly unappealing. I shouldn't bother if I were you. Sometimes publishers really missed the mark when it came to releasing games in different regions. Nowadays we take for granted that games will be given worldwide release, it's just a matter of what consoles they're on. Historically, console exclusivity was much more prevalent, largely because of Nintendo's questionable ethics and ruthless business models, but this led to vastly more varied libraries to go alongside the equally varied technologies. Today's top-end video game machines are basically indistinguishable from one another, to the point where it's like deciding between different brands of mineral water. They have identical capabilities and almost identical libraries. You might gather that I'm no lover of the modern video game scene, but one thing that it does have going for it is availability. It's pretty much a guarantee that a game will be released in your region. This was not the case in the 90s. Pop and TwinBee, or TwinBee Da as it was called in Japan, is a title that fell foul to this. Originally put out in Japan in 1990, and not released anywhere else until 1994, and then only in Europe, we have a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up by the creators of the glorious Gradius series. Konami has an excellent pedigree for shoot-'em-ups, as we know. The game is not based on Parodius as I originally thought. Rather, Parodius is kind of like a cross between a TwinBee game and a Gradius game. In fact, TwinBee is a series going back to the arcades of 1985 that didn't really show its face in North America. It turns out that in 1993, a title called Pop and TwinBee was released in Japan and Europe for the SNES/Super Famicom. And so, to tie in with this, Konami decided to rename this little gem and release it on Game Boy in Europe. As a Konami shoot-'em-up, it's got a lot to live up to, but it does stand up on its own and is by no means a carbon copy of Gradius. You have a kind of life bar, where your ship is flanked by a little circle on either side. If you get hit on the right side, you'll lose the little circle on that side, but not die. Get hit again on that side and you'll explode, but the left side can still take a hit. These don't help you if you come into contact with an enemy, you just die straight away. But this is a neat modification on the shield mechanism found in other games, and you get it from the start. The circles are also replenishable by collecting medikits. I find this really helpful because there is a surprisingly high level of projectiles on screen at times, more than you'd imagine the Game Boy could handle. What's really impressive is that there is virtually no sprite flicker at all, and no discernible slowdown. Konami used the alternate frame overlay technique to effectively double the number of visible sprites. Your shields and bullets all flicker like this, but seeing as how the Game Boy runs at 60 FPS, it appears as being partially translucent, but definitely visible. What this did was give the programmers license to throw all manner of stuff at you, meaning those couple of hits you can take are invaluable. Having said that, the game doesn't cheat you that much. Occasionally you'll get blindsided by a swarm of enemies coming from one side of the screen, but as long as you don't hug the edges too much, you should be fine. If you've ever played Parodius, you'll be familiar with the giant bells that fly towards you sometimes. Juggling them with your bullets causes them to change colour, giving different bonuses. Well, this is where they come from. Here you'll often be presented with clouds, bubbles or some such thing that, if you shoot them, a bell comes out and hurtles towards you. You can shoot at them and they rebound away. They give more points the more you collect without missing one, up to 10,000 points a time, and they're worth getting because you get an extra life every 100,000 points. What's really handy with these though is the occasional power-ups they drop. The idea is that you shoot the bells until they change colour, at least that's what you do in colorized versions such as the one found on Konami GB Collection Volume 3. It's harder to see on the original Game Boy version, but you can just about make out a different shading. The upgrades are necessary too, as the basic weapon is pretty weak and there are no missiles or laser upgrades. You first get a double shot and then a triple. There is a kind of option pickup whereby two ghosts of your craft mimic your movements and shots. Another cool pickup is this basketball thing that flies around the screen, smashing everything it hits. Many enemies are stationary on the ground. Turrets, skulls, hands, and all manner of weird things in that cute-'em-up style that Konami did so well, and you can hit these by dropping bombs with the A button. You don't have to be too accurate, simply being close enough is enough for the game to auto-target them, and they always drop points. and occasionally a star that wipes out the whole screen. These seem to come about at the most frantic times, so even if you're swamped in a dogfight, try to hit those ground targets too. Like I say, aiming is not paramount, so it's certainly worth it. The graphics are cute and funny, which you would expect, and the amount of stuff they managed to put on screen is astounding. If you're overwhelmed, it's because there's so much going on, not because the system couldn't handle it. The music is as memorable as some of Konami's other timeless shoot-em-ups. We came to expect some stunning soundtracks from Konami, and this Audible offering is right up there. The boss music is a stark contrast to the cheerfulness of the levels, and oh man, that explosion sound. The bosses themselves are not that hard, but they look great. Just before the final boss, you have a boss rush of 5 different mini-bosses, who happen to be bosses from older TwinBee arcade games, whose attack patterns are quite varied. Individually, these are not so tough. They don't have as much health as the main game bosses, but even so, tackling 5 in a row is no mean feat. Then you go through a door labelled with the kanji for Origin, and you're onto the main boss, who has its own level and some funny dialogue beforehand. I dare you to fell Cyber Popo. I don't know. So, although the European release was a bit of a cash-in on the SNES version, Pop and TwinBee for the Game Boy is an excellent title that we can be grateful to have. It's such a shame it took so long to be released anywhere outside Japan. Even more so that North America missed out altogether. Good movies have something of a notoriety for producing pretty uninspired video games. It's maybe a little generous to call the second Ghostbusters film good, certainly compared to the first one, but even so, the 8-bit era gave us some rather horrendous Ghostbusters games. Except, that is, in Europe. The Master System title followed the same idea as the god-awful North American NES release, but was definitely a better version of it. The PAL-exclusive NES title, New Ghostbusters 2, is, on the other hand, an excellent game that North America really missed out on. This Game Boy game is, thankfully, a rendition of the good one. The storyline follows the second film. The evil tyrant Vigo is trying to resurrect himself, but he needs a human child to do so. His possessed servant, Janus Pohar, played by Peter McNichol, is tasked with kidnapping Sigourney Weaver's baby, Oscar. The Ghostbusters gotta get him back. You first choose 2 of the 4 main Ghostbusters. There's no difference between the characters except for the sprites. They really look like the film characters. Bill Murray's receding hairline and Harold Ramis's spectacles give a glorious charm to the overall look of the game. The aim is to progress through the various stages by capturing a specific number of ghosts within the time limit. The first character that you choose is the one that you control, and primarily you're using the proton beam. Press A to fire the beam at a ghost, which paralyzes it. The second character is the AI that accompanies you, and he carries the trap box. You need to paralyze the ghosts and then hold B to try to get the AI partner to vacuum them. The AI isn't always great. They'll follow you around as best they can, but will often get stuck or lost, so try not to leave them behind. Trapping an enemy in the proton beam is easy enough, but you then often have to maneuver to one side to give your buddy enough room to suck it up. It's not immediately intuitive, but you soon get used to it. Ghosts are varied and each have their own threats. Some, like the Slimers, are easy enough to trap and capture. Others, such as the clown things and the spinning marionettes, are really quick and not always visible, so you have to be alert the whole time in order to not get caught out. Along the way, you'll come across several of the other characters, some of which swap out with your frontman, giving temporary access to some other weapons. These can allow you to fire a flamethrower style thing, or use the vacuum trap without having to trap ghosts. Some other characters give you lives, or temporary shields. You can also find pickaxes, which allow you to carve through walls, and a ghost suit that allows you to pass through any obstacle for a short while. You faithfully follow the storyline of the film, including a cutscene of the famous bit where the team use an NES Advantage to pilot the Statue of Liberty over 3 levels of multiple floors, through the courthouse, sewer, and museum scenes. After a handful of floors, you'll fight bosses, including the Scoleri brothers, the Ghost Train, Janus, and finally Vigo himself. The game looks absolutely delightful and is accompanied by a great soundtrack. Some may find the noise of the proton beam a smidge annoying, and they'd be justified in that feeling, but I don't mind it too much. I have to commend the originality of this one. A bloody brilliant title that flips the good movie, bad game trend right around. This is not the same thing as Monster Truck Wars, released much later in all regions except Japan in 1994. Nor is it related to Monster Trucks, or even Monster Truck Madness, both Game Boy Advance titles. No, this is worse. Much worse. You race against 4 other trucks, although you only ever see one of them at any one time, along a series of assault courses filled with jumps, logs, rubble, and other monster trucky obstacles. Your beast can wheelie by pressing left or right, depending on which axle you want to balance on. Supposedly this helps you traverse the hazards. The intention was clearly to create some Excite Bike or Motocross Maniacs kind of deal here, but Monster Truck comes nowhere remotely close to either of those games. Firstly, your movement is so irritatingly slow that it doesn't even feel like a racing game. I know monster trucks are not the speediest of vehicles, but they could have been an aside at the illusion. You accelerate with B, but the rate it takes to get up to even your pathetic top speed is a joke. At first I thought I was doing something wrong, but no, that's how it was programmed. Slow as it feels you might be going, it apparently isn't slow enough. You cannot race towards any of the obstacles, you have to slow to a dead crawl to avoid doing this bonkers backflip upon contact with even the smallest log. You'd imagine that leaning your car forwards or backwards would help in navigating these bumps, but that's because you played Motocross Maniacs already. That makes absolutely no difference here. It exists only so that once your speed has dropped down to 0, you then have to tilt your truck back to climb over it. Not actually possible from a stationary position IRL. Heck, I'm not able to do justice to how bad the programming is here. Just play it out of morbid curiosity. You'll see what I'm driving at within around 30 seconds. When overtaking an opponent, rapidly tap upwards to ram them and spin them. If you don't, they'll do it to you, and you crash every time. Sometimes they do it right from the start, before you even have control over your own car. It's cheap stuff like that I hate more than probably anything in a video game. The game hampering you unfairly without giving you a chance to respond. That's the only semblance of competitiveness you'll get from them. Otherwise, they drive even slower than you do. The graphics are lame, everything is way too dark, which is fine on an emulator, but try playing this on your DMG, I dare you. Even at the highest gamma setting, it's so hard to see anything. Don't worry though, you're not missing out on any graphical mastery by any stretch. If the graphics suck, the sound quality actually hurts. One 10-second song loop and no engine noise. In a racing game, a fact that beggars belief. Usually with dud games, there's a redeeming factor to be found. It's really hard to say anything positive about Monster Truck. It's a lot rarer. I say rare rather than hard to find, which would indicate someone was actually looking for it, and a lot more expensive than the 1994 release, so you're unlikely to get them mixed up. That's as good as I can do, sorry. Also, it's a lie. because that's exactly how I came to own the game. Released on the same day, in the same genre, and exclusive to the same region as, up to now anyway, officially the worst Game Boy game in existence, comes another racing game. Thankfully, Roadster is much better. In fact, I dare say this one is actually pretty good. Once I figured out the controls, that is. The first few races I wondered why everyone was so much faster than me. My car would reach 112 kilometers an hour and no higher, regardless of which character I chose, while everyone else sped off. That's because there are 2 gears in the game, but you don't switch between them with up or down as you do in Chase HQ or something like that. You first must get up to speed by pressing the B button, and then switch to A button for the higher gear. A little unusual perhaps, but I suppose when you're trying to steer, you don't also want to push up and down. It's odd that there's no brake, but then it's not one of those races where you'll really use it. The graphics are quite conservative, but what was put down is very effective. The races take place from a top-down perspective, but you can see far enough in front of you that you shouldn't get too caught out by the tracks. 6 cars can be displayed on screen at the same time, with very little flicker or lag to speak of. It's a shame all the cars look the same, but it's always clear which one's yours, so I guess it doesn't matter that much. The scenery varies nicely. It's obvious when you're in a city, with the buildings either side of the roads and train tracks that you cross on some stages, things of that nature. After each race you can spend a point increasing either your tyres, traction or cornering ability, or body, how much damage you can take. The top speeds never change, which possibly explains why you all drive the same car. Coming into contact with another car spins you around, but it doesn't seem to hamper you that much. You'll take a little damage, enough and you'll need to pit or suffer retirement, but typically you won't lose much speed, and with a slight direction adjustment you'll be right back on your way. What does harm you is if you crash too hard into the sides of the track. That brings you to a dead stop, but not only that, it flings you bodily out of the car, and you'll have to run road rash style back to it to rejoin the race. It amused me a couple of times, and then made me angry at my opponents after that, which is probably the intended response. Some tracks are circuits with laps, some are point-to-point through city streets. You get 10 points for a win, and it seems that if you manage to beat the course record, you even get a bonus point. Others move away from the city into the forests, complete with rock obstacles littering the track. These will frustrate you, but thankfully the opponents aren't immune to them either. The last lot of stages are at the beach, complete with water hazards that you have to jump over. Plenty of variation. Graphically, it's decent. Audibly, it's excellent. Fast-paced beats suitable for any tarmac shredding experience, each stage having its own unique theme, coupled with, what's that? Engine noise? Oh my days! The controls work perfectly. Some of the races are circuits, which inevitably mean that at times you'll be racing towards the bottom of the screen. Rather than make the baffling mistake that some racing games make, left and right turn the car to its left and right, rather than the left or right of the screen. You'd think that was common sense, but unfortunately that wasn't always the case. So, one game removed from what might well turn out to be the absolute nadir of the entire library, comes one of its much higher standard releases. Roadster is right up there with the greats like Micro Machines or V-Rally. These guys are much later on though. To get so much right in 1990 makes it even stranger that Roadster never left Japan. In a library so replete with puzzle titles, you need to be doing something pretty special to stand out. When I find one that was Japan only, I feel a slight foreboding dread coming on. So many middle-of-the-road puzzlers came out on Game Boy in the West that you have to be going some to make one that wouldn't interest publishers over here. And doing what I'm doing, I'm going to have to play it and try to discover why it was never exported. In Amida, you're a cross between Kirby and Dizzy, just without any of the charm or innovation of those two. Your circular buddy wanders vertically down one of these parallel pipelines, only one of which has a safe endpoint. The other two have big skulls that indicate a horrible, horrible death. You need to guide him to the safe one. Thing is, the dude is pretty stupid and will just wander his stupid smiling way right into these traps. Why are we even saving this little dumbass? Natural selection wouldn't want us to. Along the way there are also death traps, on the pipes themselves or along connecting bridges. If Amida-kun comes to a bridge, he'll cross it, regardless of whether it's safe. The only control you have over his perambulation is this bridge with a face that you can move in between the three pipes. Press A to set it down and B to lift it back up. In doing so, you can guide him onto the safe path, bearing in mind that you'll often have to move him around several times in quick succession. This brings up my first dislike with the gameplay mechanic. Having to press A to lock the bridge in place and then B to move it again is unnecessary. It would have been much more fluid to just be able to move the path. Until you get into the habit of pressing B, you can be trying to move the bridge to the next location in the minuscule amount of time you have, only for it to not budge at all. The second thing I noticed that really gripes me, and this is a major one, is the fact that you only have 3 lives. That's not enough for a game like this. Often you want to try a level time and time again to get it right, and you can't here. Imagine in a game like Boxel if you only got a couple of goes and then it's game over. What if you'd spent 2 hours getting to level 40, only for the game to kick you in the nuts and say, "Sorry mate, you're done." Every 10 stages you get a password, but even so, 3 lives aren't enough. I hope you really enjoy redoing previously completed levels. The third thing that puts me off this game is perhaps subjective, but it's a big one, personally. The game's boring. I've lost interest by the 4th or 5th stage. There's very little appeal to sit and play through Soriyuki Amida-kun for very long. Nah, this one's not for me. All hands on deck, it's time for another round of naval warfare. Yep, Radar Mission is another battleship game. Technically this is the third one, as Navy Blue came out in Japan earlier, and depending on whether you consider Power Mission to be a battleship game. But actually this was the second one that we saw in the West. It's got a lot to stand up against, as I've already waxed plenty lyrical about my love for Pack-In Video's Battleship. Radar Mission is actually just as good. That's a bold claim, and you may be thinking at this point that I'm some oddball battleship fanboy. I promise I'm not. I don't really care much for board games at all. It's just that these two titles have been a couple of stellar early releases. The music was a real plus point for me in the earlier game, and while none of the tracks are quite as awesome as that battle music from before, I really must praise the variation in Radar Mission. The song changes depending on how your battle is progressing. If the enemy gets you down to your last ship, the music speaks of foreboding dangers. Similarly, if you're not far from victory, the tune becomes more marching. The sound effects are effectively used too, and sound great, with a little klaxon-like aid if you miss by 1 square. Graphically, it's certainly on a par as well. The overview of the grid is smaller, but everything you need is there, and you get a handful of information boxes telling you what enemy craft remain, as well as your turn count. You can switch easily between your field and the opponent's with a touch of the A button, and the radar sweep across the grid looks pretty cool. The firing and sinking animations are very good. There are 2 game modes. Game A is the normal battleship-style game, although there is a storyline to the campaign. You have a few options, an 8x8, 10x10 or 12x12 grid, and you can toggle the aircraft or near-miss sirens on or off, as well as Lucky Shot, which I'll detail later. The game progresses in a campaign mode, with 3 levels. this doesn't sound like much, but the levels take time. The first 2 in the campaign are at sea, and the final one sees you attacking the enemy HQ with tanks and a runway in lieu of the usual naval fighters. You only get a battleship and a destroyer with which to do this though. You have the usual assortment of ships to place and fight. Also, there's an option to launch an aircraft that looks like an FA-18 or something, that will take off, flying around between a few different squares, and you've got to take this out as well. I presume that if you manage to destroy the aircraft carrier before it takes off, it happens around turn 15 on the first level, then the plane goes down with it, but I've never managed this so can't tell you. Whereas before you had a range of special weapons at your disposal, unfortunately they don't exist here, although there is something called a lucky shot. If you manage to fire a missile onto one of these predetermined lucky shot spaces, a few different effects can occur on your next turn, such as a spread shot or instant destruction of any ship hit. Game B is quite different, as in it's basically an entirely different game. Here you control a submarine moving left and right, targeting a number of enemy ships above the water. You move slowly when at the surface, but can increase your speed below depths. You need to surface to shoot anything, and the enemy submarine can still destroy you below. Fire torpedoes with A and machine guns with B, with unlimited ammo. The torpedoes are most useful for enemies at range. There are upgrades that you can buy between stages depending on how successful you've been. These increase your propeller speed, double your torpedoes to 2, and improve the sonar that you can use underwater to find enemies. Sure, it's not as addictive as the main game, but I have to give real credit for going the extra mile in adding this gameplay mode. Particularly notable here are the graphics, and the Jaws-like theme music that speeds up when you're submerged. I really like these 2 games. Power Mission, not so much, and can't choose between them. Maybe I slightly prefer this one. Fortunately, I have both, so I don't have to choose. Gosh, maybe I am a fanboy. Sometimes you don't need an elaborate story to make a great game. Afterburst may have some sort of plot, who knows. From what I can gather, it's a story of a robot who's trying to destroy some sort of lab or space station. You control said robot around 30 small levels, often, but not always, single screen, and your aim is to destroy this orb or core that is hidden somewhere. Trying to stop you from doing so are a multitude of defences such as airships and other walkers. Your little mech probably isn't the greatest tool for the job, as it explodes with one hit, and can't support any impact from above, as even the smallest of falling blocks also destroys you. You're armed with a cannon with infinite bullets and a wide range of control. Physics and gravity play a large part in your aiming. You can shoot at any angle between horizontal and vertically upwards, with a very fluid directional spread. You're not restricted to 30 or 45 degrees, for example. Also, it's necessary to gauge the charge of your shot as well, because your bullets arc towards the ground, so it's possible to hit ground targets at various ranges. Fully charge your shot and it actually defies gravity, shooting off in the direction indefinitely. So there's a full array of shots that you can take, and the puzzles are designed in such a way that you'll need all of them at some point. Getting used to the weapon in Afterburst reminds me of getting used to the bazooka in Worms. It's a very similar mechanic, apart from the wind factor. It's a devious little game, that's for sure. Often you'll shoot out a block only for the ones above it to come crashing down on you. It's necessary to do things in a specific order too, although there is usually more than one way to beat levels. You get a password every 5 stages and a boss every 10. The bosses are inventive, often with a trick to beating them based on the makeup of the stage. There are only 30 levels in total, but what the game lacks in length, it makes up for in challenge. The time limit is very stingy sometimes, you can't hang around. The gameplay itself, while not completely unique, is a lot of fun, and the difficulty level is about right. What really left an impression on me though, is the presentation of this game.
The music is outstanding right from the start. While not a huge soundtrack, it's beautifully composed, using the full scope of possible tones from the sound chip, and a level theme that jams itself in your head. I must give credentials to Atsuhiro Motoyama for doing such a wonderful job putting this one together. The graphics are almost as good as the sound. Everything is quite small, but very well detailed. Everything looks polished and crisp, artistically shaded sprites and subtle backgrounds, and the cover art is gorgeous. There's an extra game mode, you versus either the computer or a second player via link cable, which I imagine is a lot of fun. Here you have an arena with a terrain of blocks, and the aim is to destroy the opponent before they get to you. Afterburst is a very clever game which absolutely nails the magic formula of easy to pick up, hard to master. The ending is kind of lame. It's one of those congratulations deals, and I'm really just surmising about any kind of story. But there's no text in the game anyway, so don't worry about missing anything. There are a handful of Japan-exclusive games that I absolutely implore you to check out. This is one that would have done really well had it crossed continents. It sold well in Japan, so shouldn't be too expensive if you'd like to get one sent over. I would recommend it. An amazing thing that the Game Boy allowed you to do was play full-blown video games on the move, and it needs to be appreciated how big a deal this actually was in the late 80s. Sure, there were other handhelds, but who wants to hear about them? It was the Game Boy that really pushed this idea of portability. If you were heading off on a long-haul flight, the Game Gear would have ran out of battery before you'd even left the departure lounge. Sacrificing processing power and, well, colours really allowed the Game Boy library to flourish, and now, well into the 21st century as we are, and don't mind graphical limitations as much, seeing as how every retro console looks primitive next to modern video games, we can really begin to appreciate what amazing games did exist on the system. Despite the limitations, it amazes me more than anything when we get something more than just a puzzle or platform game. The most ambitious and most successful titles were often RPGs, huge adventures with multiple layers of depth and game mechanics that fit in your pocket. Nowadays we have amazing titles on even smaller portables, of course, but look, fitting a game like Roland's Curse onto a cartridge half the size of a cassette tape was such a feat back then. The game is an action RPG more in the vein of Zelda than Final Fantasy. Without getting into the debate of whether Zelda is an RPG or not, seriously, don't worry about it. You play as a noble hero who needs to save the people of Roland from the evil King Barrios and his hordes of regenerating monsters. There are 3 types of maps, and they're standard tropes: towns, fields or dungeons, and the boss. When in towns, just wander around and talk to people, or don't, they don't say much, and basically walk to the other side. The majority of the game takes place in these semi-linear routes between towns. You transition between screens that usually have respawning enemies, who drop power-ups and weapons. A glaring omission is the lack of any AI at all, including the bosses. Enemies will charge down a pre-scripted path, firing spontaneously. This makes the game pretty easy with a little observation. Only the final boss presents any real challenge, once you've established the safe zones. Movement is a little tricky at first. Your hero moves on a half-square basis and cannot turn around on the spot, so you can't just walk up beside something and attack. You need to stand so that you can slash into its projected path. There are only 2 weapons, a sword that attacks close to you and a fire wand, which fires 3 spaces ahead. They do the same damage, so there's never really any reason to use the sword. The thing is, you can only carry 1 weapon, and picking up the other one means you lose the first until you can find one again. Due to the restricted movement, being able to attack from a distance is very important here, so avoid those swords at all cost. Leveling up is strange, but I kind of get what they were trying to do. You have an attack power and a life power, which you can boost up to 16 and 32 respectively. Killing certain enemies drops strength gloves and armor pickups, amongst other things, which will raise your values. Seeing as how enemies constantly respawn, it's pretty straightforward to max out your abilities straight away. The thing is, these stats reduce somewhat when you complete a stage, meaning it's really up to you how long you want to grind for. Honestly, the game isn't that hard, so you shouldn't need to go all the way. Roland's Curse isn't what you'd call a long game. It's a couple of hours for first-time players, sure, but there are only 4 chapters. There are nice cutscene narratives between each part detailing the story to you. Upon death, you regress into a sperm. It's supposed to be a ghost, I suppose, which flies away, but don't worry, there are password saves between each chapter and unlimited continues. I would definitely suggest you play to the last chapter because it's the best part of the whole game. Here you're presented with some hauntingly beautiful music in a proper eerie town. I'm talking Lavender Town level of eerie, with even better music if you can imagine such a thing. And there's but one inhabitant of this ghost town, who gives you a lengthy speech about how you've proven your valor. Now go on and defeat the evil Barrios. Well, he also tells you to go and rock that turkey, whatever that means. Once you reach the final boss, the fight itself is not too hard, but it's better than anything up to this point. Looks great too, and is accompanied by one of the thrashiest rock songs to ever come from a Game Boy. Roland's Curse has a truly commendable soundtrack all round. It's not a cheap game, and its sequel can be downright expensive, but I'd recommend if you can find it. Take a moment to embrace the truly mad here. Mr. Chin is in hot pursuit of his favourite treat. He's come all the way from China to eat as many luscious gourmet peaches as he can, before anyone else discovers how to eat this unique treat. As Mr. Chin, you must pursue the mysterious momos and zap them into peaches with your demo beam. So hurry up and run, jump, zap and eat as many peaches as you can, before they make dinner out of you. Gourmet Paradise is an action platform game where the aim is to trap these monsters horizontally between 2 pairs of landmines. The distance between the 2 doesn't matter, so long as it's uninterrupted. Any 2 on a horizontal plane will fire a laser between them, turning any enemy caught in the crossfire into an edible arse with legs. It's supposed to be a peach, which Mr. Chin can then devour. These enemies will then respawn, allowing you to kill them again until you've reached the level quota. This can be a problem. There's no delay in respawning enemies, rather they immediately drop from the top of the screen, meaning if you're on the top floor trying to collect a whole row of converted enemies, you can easily perish unexpectedly by one dropping on your head. Some cooldown would have benefited this game a lot. These types of death feel really cheap. I guess you just need to be astute in expecting it, but to this point, I'm just not. The movement is very fast, to the point where Mr. Chin is actually quite hard to control. You can smash blocks from below. They take a few hits, but this lets you maneuver levels differently, and also create traps for your victims. Also, it can reveal a small bomb, which turns any enemy on the level into its edible form. Good for quickly racking up lots of kills. There are bonus stages after every 2 normal levels, where you just have to collect as many peaches as possible. There are often ways to manipulate these, so they spawn right on top of you, racking up thousands of points in a short time. In fact, a little amusing tidbit is that, seeing as how you're a gourmand, your score is measured in kilocalories consumed rather than points. Call me sad, but I appreciate little details like that. There are lots of different music tracks. They vary each level, giving a lovely variation that you don't often hear. I'm reminded with a shudder of a game like Boxall, where it's the same track all the way through the game. And the accompanying sound effects suit the game well. The whole audio is delightfully put together. The graphics are excellently done. The enemies are varied and the backgrounds clear and well drawn. Everything is a good size, although there's a lot of blank screen in places, which lets the look down a bit. It's a tough nut to crack if you're hoping to beat this game. The lack of a password save means the levels are going to be a really difficult ask to claw your way through. The game loops after a while anyway, there's no ending as such. Good luck, that's all I can say. Overall, a clever idea that's put together very well, but with a tough difficulty curve and cheap deaths all over the place. This'll take some getting used to, but it's pretty good. I may lose some of my man points for saying this, but Balloon Kid has to be one of the cutest things I've ever seen, and we had Labrador puppies when I was a kid. On a system that gave birth to Kirby and Pikachu, as well as the little cats from Cat Rap, it's fair to say that Alice is equally as adorable. That this game was later released on the Famicom in Japan as a Hello Kitty game should tell you as much. Anyway, in Balloon Kid, you have to adventure across a world filled with a pencil town called Pennsylvania, a forest, an ocean complete with a giant whale, and an ice mountain, in order to save your younger brother Jim. He's not been kidnapped, rather, he was up floating on balloons when a stiff breeze took him away. He did manage to leave a trail of balloons for Alice to follow, so that's how we'll find him. You're attached to these balloons, and you need to float along avoiding all sorts of obstacles such as birds, spikes, flames and the like. Gravity works on you to bring you to the ground, but pressing A flaps your arms and increases height. It's quite a fluid movement mechanic, which, while floaty, literally, does work for the gimmick. The movement is different, but totally fair, and you should pick it up with a little skill, and in fact, I grew to like it. The levels auto-scroll and you need to collect balloons along the way. You don't need to get a certain amount or anything, but each one is worth 100 points, and collecting 100 on a stage gives you an extra life. Pressing B detaches you from the balloons, allowing you to walk along the ground. You can run and jump over obstacles, which is necessary to collect some hidden treasures, as your balloons won't fit through. If these are in dead ends though, make sure you can get out before the auto-scrolling catches up with you. Once grounded, press down a few times to inflate another balloon. You can blow up 2 balloons, which change your movement pattern, and also allows you to take a hit from any airborne creatures, as only one of your balloons will pop, meaning you can carry on floating. I tend to keep 2 inflated as much as possible. I find it makes the movement a little bit easier. Once a certain number of balloons have been gathered, they actually double, so each pickup is worth 2. Also, after a time a flashing P balloon appears, which turns you invincible for a good period of time. You can still die via pits or water, or by getting trapped in the scrolling, but otherwise you can knock out enemies with a satisfying force. The balloons you collect along the way get tallied up, and for every balloon you have left at the end of each stage, you get 100 points. There are hidden, usually in places you have to walk to, giant Game Boys which are actually entrances to bonus stages, whereby balloons are floating upwards out of Mario pipes, and you collect as many as you can. There are bosses in the game which need to be jumped on in order to kill. To do this, you inflate the balloons and float above the monsters, then detach yourself at just the right moment. Pretty tricky, but really well designed and great fun. There's also a 2-player game, whereby you and a friend play as Alice and her rival Sam, who compete to see who can collect the most balloons within a stage. Like I say, the game looks and sounds really cute, although if there's any detrimental factor, it's possibly too easy. That's alright though. The concept is a refreshing one, and I really must praise the movement physics. They work exactly how they should, and never rip you off. If you screw up, it's your own fault. It's especially commendable to note the different mechanics whether you're walking or floating. To program several different ones and get them all right is some accomplishment. No Nintendo library would be complete without an entry from our favourite Tokyo-hating reptile. Godzilla is a strange example of a game that was released in North America slightly before Japan. You might be thinking that this is a port of the NES Monster of Monsters game, but you'd be wrong, even though the same developers and publishers were involved. Whereas the NES game was a side-scrolling action game, this is basically nothing like that. Don't ask me what Godzilla has to do with anything here, it's clearly another one of those tacked-on mascot deals that makes little sense. Anyway, you play this dinosaur that looks like Barney with a massive Popeye-esque fist, who has to maneuver various rooms while punching boulders, rampage style. There are a ton of enemies coming after you, which constantly fall out of this lemming hole thing. You score points for punching them out or dropping a boulder on them, but it's not a requirement to get rid of them all or anything. The idea of each stage is to crack through all the boulders. Do that, and these blocks with arrows on them appear, pointing in one of the 4 cardinal directions. These take you to another screen in the particular direction of the arrow, which gives the game its shtick. It's not just individual puzzles you need to navigate, but a quite non-linear maze that will no doubt lead you to plenty of backtracking through previously beaten rooms. The maze is 8 scenes across by 8 deep, and the aim of the whole deal is to get to a particular room somewhere deep in the labyrinth. It's not the bottom right you're aiming for either, just as a hint. It's somewhere in the middle. Believe me, if you're not mapping this out, you're going to be stuck in here for ages. It's not a one-hit KO game. You have a health bar, but no invulnerability frames upon hit, so this can drop alarmingly quickly. A lot of enemies die in one punch, and the hit detection is very generous, so I wouldn't say it's unfair really, but you definitely need to keep moving. The music makes absolutely no sense for this to be a Godzilla title. It's upbeat and chirpy, like your quintessential Japanese platform puzzle game. Well, let me rephrase that then. The music fits the game, but the Godzilla gimmick really doesn't. That flying enemy's supposed to be Rodan, I don't know. Let the opening credits run for some gorgeous looking pictures of the monsters alongside their cartoonish representations, if you care. But honestly, this game feels like it should have had Alex Kidd as its mascot instead. It's weird because the Western version of the intro screen looks and sounds exactly how you'd imagine a Godzilla game would, but then the game starts, and you're left scratching your head. At least in the Japanese version, the character looks as cartoony at the start as he does in-game. The gameplay elements are nothing new, but I like the fact that it's non-linear, and you'll probably need to map it out a little. The music is chirpy, but actually very good, although some of the in-game sound effects are a bit too Atari. Godzilla is a tough old sausage, that's for sure. There are a few screens with a cheap death or two until you learn them, and you can easily get stuck if you don't plan out your method. Don't worry that you'll have to play through in one sitting though, there are 2 different passwords. A 4-character one that allows you to start from whatever level you're currently on, and an 18-character one that also retains your score and lives. Strange to see 2 different save passwords, but a nice idea. It's a cool little title that has a lot of joy within it, but is as confusing as it is amusing. Back in the 80s and 90s, princesses were getting kidnapped all too often. It was the done thing, a court fad, if you will. Apparently, this even applied to amorphous blobs, as we see in the Game Boy exclusive sequel to A Boy and His Blob for the NES. If you've played that game, the premise here is the same, a series of sometimes intuitive, sometimes quite abstract puzzles that revolve around feeding your pet blob certain flavours of jelly beans, which cause him to morph into various apparatuses. So yeah, same old storyline, but quite unique gameplay mechanics. The controls take a while to get used to. Your character, Boy, moves based on momentum, so speeds up as he goes along, sliding a little when coming to a stop. You cycle through the beans with Select and throw them to your buddy with A. Pressing B whistles for Blob to come back to you, which, if he's morphed, will cause him to return to his neutral state. There is a bit of a learning wall to get over. Not just with the controls, but figuring out what all the beans do. The game doesn't tell you this until you use them, so it's beneficial to write all these down. For instance, the first one that you're shown is licorice, which turns Blob into a ladder. There's no intuitive way to remember that. You could use initials, of course, but then there are lime beans too, which make Blob into a key. Like key lime. Cola makes a bubble. Tangerine makes a trampoline. Oh hell, I don't know, just write them down. I'm not going to go through them all because there are lots of funny and clever devices to solve puzzles, which you'd enjoy more by discovering them, and I implore you to stay away from an FAQ unless you're completely stuck. Anyway, try everything, even if it makes no sense, because, come on, you're feeding jelly beans to a scrotum with a face, so clearly reality has no place here. You do have a limited number of beans though, so can trap yourself if you run out. Blob doesn't move on his own, you need to summon him by whistling, and he'll then move to your location. It can occasionally be tricky to get Blob in the position you need him in, as he can't be on the same space as you, so often you get pushed out the way. I've been pushed into spikes a couple of times because of this. As well as rescuing the eponymous Blobette, there are 18 treasures to collect, none of which really do anything other than garner points. Also lying about are coins, that upon collecting 5 will give you an extra life. You start with 5 lives, and Boy is kind of fragile. Falling too far kills him, as do these little invincible worm things. Overall, the game looks alright. There's a lot of repetition in backgrounds, and everything is simply drawn, but the animations are really nice. The characters have a cartoonish charm to them, as does the music. Sadly, there's only one song, and it kind of sounds like the Indiana Jones theme, but it's well composed enough to not get too annoying. Some of the sound effects in the game override it in such a way that only half the channels of the song play, which make it sound really weird, but the effects themselves are clear. The wolf whistle really does sound like one, and the crash that these stomper things make is quite foreboding. The rescue of Princess Blobette, or to give it its full name, David Crane's A Boy and His Blob in The Rescue of Princess Blobette, is actually a delightful title with tons of charm and tongue-in-cheek humour. It's cool that the game is a new adventure rather than just being a port of the original. If you can get past the controls, which aren't bad, merely unusual, there is a lot of fun to be had here. It feels almost like a cosmic spacehead or, dare I say it, Monkey Island. Recommended if you want a clever and humorous puzzle game that's not limited to one screen. There were many games that were loosely based on Formula 1 racing, some were mere nomenclature than anything close to a simulation, but the first one that many of us were exposed to, and undoubtedly the first that springs to most people's minds, is Nintendo's F1 race. I was something of a fan of the sport in the 90s, before it completely lost its way and became the snooze fest it is nowadays, and this is not at all how I remember it. Racing games of the time were mostly either top-down or a third-person perspective, with a static car and moving backgrounds. This is the latter, and the overall look of the game is standard for the time. If you've played something like Outrun or Chase HQ, then F1 Race is not dissimilar. It's not as nice to look at as it could be, there are no inclines of any kind, and the backgrounds look pretty drab. The foregrounds are quite clever, as the striped ground either side of the track changes contrast depending on your speed. At low speeds, it's white and black. Increase up and the black changes to a dark grey, changing to a light grey and white at the highest speeds. This really gives a feeling of pace and is a very nice effect. Strangely, if you play this on a colorized palette, the ground can sometimes look like it's changing colors. There's no gear shifting in the game, you just press A to accelerate and B to brake. You know how this works. Pushing up on the D-pad allows you to use Nitro Boost for a finite amount of time, indicated by a fuel gauge on the HUD. You're given a pretty generous supply too, as all races are only 2 laps and you can't really use the boost on the corners. When boosting, the feeling of speed becomes really prevalent. Flames come out the back of your car and you get this awesome whirring sound that could double up as a jet plane. The draw distance isn't superb, and often you need to brake in good time to make some of the corners, but fortunately you're given a satellite map feature that shows both you and the first place CPU on it, and it's pretty accurate. Pay attention to this if you can so that you can plan your boosts and braking zones accordingly. There are 2 different cars to choose from. Car B is faster, but only has a small nitro tank, and the higher top speed makes it harder to corner. I just chose Car A all of the time, as some of the less tight corners can be taken without having to decelerate, which more than makes up for the lower top speed. If you crash out, there's little chance of you having enough time to come first. As you might expect, the opponents never crash. You need to come first to progress to the next race, which is definitely not how an F1 season works. Aside from the championship season, there is also a time trial mode, with a save battery included in the cartridge that enables you to save your fastest laps. This was quite a thing back then, you understand. Being able to save your game was actually a selling point. F1 Race is not a technical marvel by any means, but for the time it was fun and very popular, not least for the use of a 4-way adapter that meant you could race with 3 of your friends too. Some cameos from famous Nintendo mascots, including Link's and Samus's first appearances on the Game Boy, only added to the charm. Have you ever seen a sequel released so soon after the original? Less than 6 months after the first Trump Boy game was released, we have a second one. It's a sequel only in name, really. It's actually more of a remake. There are a lot of recycled parts here. 3 games available again, the first of which is the same as the original Daifugo. However, the AI has been rebalanced, making the games a bit fairer. They still seem to gang up on you to a degree, and the graphics are a lot nicer to look at. The music is just as annoying, more so actually, unless you like the entertainer, and mostly recycled, but at least the visual aesthetics have vastly improved, with some cute looking animals featuring among the opponents you can choose. The second game has been replaced by a version of Uno, similar to what we saw in Card Game. The third game was a massively unfair matching game before, where it seemed the CPU already knew where the pairs were. Thankfully, that's totally gone, in favour of a rendition of the game Parliament, which is another discard your entire hand before the others game, but at least it's better than Nervous Breakdown was. So you may be wondering exactly what the point of Trump Boy 2 was. Why was a game barely changed and re-released within half a year of its initial run? It was actually a kind of launch title for the October 9th release of the 4-player link cable adapter, similar to the game in the previous review. At the time, it was this or F1 Race. I know which one I'd choose. A conundrum I've long wondered about is the reluctance in the 80s and 90s to release RPGs in the West. I appreciate I'm looking at things through a modern day lens, but when you have even Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest seen as niche markets, it's no wonder there were so many other lesser known franchises that we missed out on entirely. And it's a real shame, especially when coming across something like Aretha, a very obviously brilliant Game Boy trilogy that would eventually spawn 6 titles across all systems. Now, I will qualify my obviously brilliant statement by saying it has all the hallmarks of an excellent game. Whether I'm accurate with that is not definite, as Aretha is not the easiest game to play with a subpar knowledge of Japanese. This title, more than normal, there is a lot of text. Fortunately, the combat system is your traditional turn-based deal, and this one works better than most. Despite this being one of the earliest uses of kanji on the Game Boy, Games before now relied on the easier-to-code phonetic systems of hiragana and katakana. Do persist if you can with the reading, as the storyline and the character development is replete with the utmost charm. Aretha is the name of the kingdom in which the game takes place, found on the continent of Artera. As you might suspect, the similarity of the names of the two places causes enough confusion on its own. King Leparton bestowed on his two daughters each a ring, one gold and one silver, resembling cat's eyes, and allowed his court wizard to bestow on them magical blessings. However, at that very moment, the evil demon Lord Howard invaded Aretha and kidnapped one of the princesses. The defending army fought valiantly but were ultimately defeated, leading the king to seal the Arethan shrine and send his remaining daughter down a river, Moses-style, in a basket. That daughter was raised by an old man named Floyd, and is the girl Materia whom you play as 10 years later, with the mission of defeating Howard and saving the world. The game is not a gentle one. Immediately you'll need to grind to get anywhere, and it's not particularly simple. Make sure you save and replenish health between each and every battle for at least the first few levels. You'll die for sure should you come across 2 or 3 enemies at once. You have to persist and pick off the single targets until you're stronger. This will probably be the case in each new area you visit. Aretha is a slow-paced, patient grind that requires you to give a chunk of your time to. However, the game is good enough to give you hints as to when you're at the right level. Once you reach the sweet spot, random encounters will slow down to the point that they barely ever happen, meaning you'll be free to explore. Anyone who's gone back through Mount Moon without rappels later in the game knows the beauty of such a quality of life improvement. Bloody Zubats. The world map is admirably large, with the overworld being decently varied. This doesn't extend as much as I'd like to the dungeons, which feel a little repetitive. There are a lot of them, and whether they're disguised as fortresses, castles or caves, they all amount to much the same thing: unnecessarily extended mazes, with rewards few and far between. You're going to want to get to the stage where the random encounters have stopped for that particular area, because otherwise they're incredibly arduous treks. Caution is the key to progression. Expect to game over regularly. Every conflict could spell your doom. Save regularly, which you can do at any city. This is especially true while Materia is on her own. She doesn't get magic until much later, meaning you don't even have a healing spell until you find a partner. Materia is a lonely lass at first, to the point where she can self-talk, a kind of hint system where Materia will chat to herself, wondering what she should do next. This became the party talk mechanic that you frequently see after this in other RPGs. So desperate for friends as she is, there's even a capture mechanic whereby you can persuade a monster to fight alongside you. It's pretty naff though. They'll only join you for one battle, and seem somewhat reluctant to fight, as they're immediately weaker than the enemies around you, meaning you probably won't use this much. Let's take a moment to admire what feels so special about Aretha. It truly is a remarkable looking game. The attention to detail is quite astounding, bearing in mind this was only 1990. The Final Fantasy titles came close to this, but realistically Aretha goes above and beyond even that. Bear in mind too that developers Yanaman didn't have the resources or experience that the Square development teams had. In fact, this was Yanaman's first game ever. Many early developers had a problem manipulating Game Boy code into half-playable RPGs. Not these guys. They hit it out of the park straight away. Localization when? The original, but not really, maze game, with overtones of drug addiction, made its first foray of several on the Game Boy in 1990, by the creators Namco themselves. Everyone knows how to play Pac-Man. You run around a darkened room to electronic bleeps and waka waka noises, munching pills. This was all the rage in the rave scene of the early 90s, but of course Pac-Man predates this somewhat, first appearing in arcades in 1980. Like I say, Pac-Man is evidently one of the most iconic games in history, with thousands of variants and rip-offs on pretty much every machine ever. If, miraculously, you've never played a version of this game, firstly, you're probably 5 years old and reading at a level way above your age, well done. And secondly, I would suggest this is not the one to start with. One of the biggest hurdles to get over when porting a game down to the small Game Boy screen is making the game fit properly. And sadly, this wasn't really achieved. One of the necessities, and a mainstay in practically every other version, is the maze being visible on one single screen. That way, you can see all you need to accomplish and where the bad guys are at all times. The Game Boy version of Pac-Man immediately shoots itself in the, well, Pac-Man doesn't have feet, but it's pretty stupid to try and spread the maze out across multiple screens. I know it's only a small screen to work with, but it can still be done. It's a bit of a design flaw, especially seeing as how such a huge swathe of the screen is taken up by the scoreboard and stuff. You can easily lose a pellet. You can sometimes leave one somewhere in the maze and then have to drift around looking for it, which is no good if you're being chased. This game is tough enough when you can see all of the pellets, but having to keep track of where you've been as well adds an unnecessary level of difficulty. Press right on the title screen and you can play in half-size mode, which does allow you to see the whole course. However, now the dots are single pixels. This is fine on a full-screen emulator or an SP, but try playing that on a DMG screen. Maybe I'm being pernickety, but Namco originated this game, so they should know what you need to do to make such a simple concept work. There's a really strange bug that's a detriment to the gameplay as well. Sometimes, when in power pellet mode, Pac-Man can just go straight through a ghost. With such a small amount of programming necessary, this game should be absolutely solid, with no bugs in sight. This happens with an alarming regularity too, so I'm sure it's not a one-off. It appears to happen most often if you've just eaten one ghost and there's another right behind it. But I mean, it happens at least once per level to me. More rigorous testing was certainly needed. Sound-wise, the game is certainly identifiable, but for some reason the noises we're accustomed to sound really grating in this version. I don't know why that is. Maybe Pac-Man always sounds irritating, but when the gameplay is good, you don't notice it as much. There are plenty of other versions of Pac-Man that you could choose over this one. There's even, and I hate to say this, a Game Gear version that I prefer. Admitting that leaves me feeling sullied and unusual, so I'm ending this review and going for a shower. Based solely on the title, if there's a more accurate way of reviewing games, I'm not aware of it, this is a cross between Parasol Stars and Pop and TwinBee, a concept I am 100% behind. In fact, Parasol Hembe is a late 80s kids anime from the same designer who made the Doraemon series. Henbei is this hippopotamus-looking creature who fell through this tunnel in a waterfall and appeared in the human world. He carries a magical parasol that lets him fly and speak to animals. It sounds like a series that has much potential in the way of video games. However, aside from this one, there's only a version for Famicom. The map screen promises a whole host of levels to progress through. There are 7 in total, ranging from the city to forest to caves. The story revolves around Henbei traversing these increasingly hostile stages to find his bird. You have little in the way of attacks. Pressing B performs this Taz-like whirlwind that knocks enemies flying at the cost of some of your health. It's unreliable, so a lot of your progress will come from avoiding enemies rather than fighting them. You jump with A and extend your parasol to float a short way by pressing up when airborne. This allows you to traverse some traps like open manholes and rivers. There is often a higher path for you to take. This is one of those 2.5D games where the illusion of depth is really just a higher and lower pathway. Level progression is nothing groundbreaking. You have to get from left to right within the time limit and not die, with bonus stages in between giving extra lives and such. The movement is a tad slippery, but nothing you can't get used to, and the hitbox detection is mostly accurate. This is by no means a perfect platformer, but it's way more palatable than some of the manga tie-ins we've seen so far. It's simple, short, to the point, with little replayability, but at least it works. Often we don't ask for much more. Give me more of this sort of thing instead of crappy fighting games based on less adorable manga. Sometimes, when endeavouring to write about every Game Boy game, you've got to battle Bull. No more so than in this quirky little title, although here you literally are battling bulls. Well, bulldozers, not the bovines. You control your vehicle around a maze, and the aim is to destroy a certain number of other bulldozers. There are several ways to do this, the most apparent being pushing certain types of blocks that make up the walls of the maze into the opponent's cars, crushing them. Push the blocks with A and they fly off until they hit something. If a block can't move, pressing A will crush it, allowing you access to other parts of the maze. Coming into contact with an enemy kills both of you, giving a crush message, if you are in any doubt as to what happened. Destroying enemies gives you gold, which you need to buy upgrades for your vehicle. You can purchase speed upgrades, better shovels for the front that speed up the recovery time after pushing or destroying a block, a jump, and some weapons too. You start with $500, and I would immediately buy the first engine upgrade because you're way too slow otherwise. Next, the first jump is also pretty cheap and can get you out of tight spots pretty nicely. You can't jump over walls, but you'll comfortably clear enemy bulldozers. The weapons are costly, and you don't start with anything, meaning initially the only way you can kill stuff is by ramming blocks into them. But that's the gimmick of the game, and it's fun to do. The hit detection with the blocks is very generous, meaning you only need a tiny part of the block to touch the enemy sprite, and it'll destroy it. The movement is a little tricky to get down though. Your bulldozer moves in half-block steps, but you can only push blocks if you're full onto them. Halfway between the two, and nothing moves. The design is fun and cartoony, and I like that when you buy upgrades in the shop, you see them physically being attached to your machine, a nice touch. This game is really cool, and the upgrade system gives incentives to progress. As the game gets tougher, so do you, and your skills should hopefully be better. It's not a common game, sadly, but if you can find it and afford it, you won't go too far wrong with Battle Ball. Stop right there. I warn you, you'll hate this game, so I'd just skip ahead. If you're still reading, then what we have here is a game by that little-known game company that also created the Popeye Maze game that I talked about not so long back. Where that one was just confusing, this one is pure evil. If you remember the Zero RC shop in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, you may recall a mission where you had to escort a remote-controlled buggy around a course by controlling this helicopter, which could remove or circumvent obstacles and destroy enemy tanks. It was kind of a frustrating mission, but doable. Now, imagine that as a whole game, with any semblance of fairness taken out. You have this tank on the ground which you don't control, but instead need to guide from the left-hand side of the screen to the right. It can climb over one square high blocks, but anything higher than that, it just crashes into the wall, losing some health, and then turns around. You pilot this plane with a gun and a hook. Press B and you can pick up a block, which you then need to move around to create a path, or just move out of the way. If you manage to get the tank far enough, There are turrets shooting at you, and it's a one-hit kill for your plane. I will give the game credit for sounding quite nice and looking rather good. It is nicely detailed with intricate backgrounds. The concept of the game may not sound too bad, and it's certainly original for the Game Boy by this point. The biggest problem is the controls. Your plane is so hard to fly, bobbing up and down like it's on the sea, and it's way too easy to crash. Connecting the hook to the blocks would be easier to do in real life than it is in this game, meaning you're flying back and forth trying to attach it while your little dumbass tank buddy repeatedly drives into walls until it explodes. Why it couldn't just wait, I don't know. It's being driven by a squadron of lemmings, I suppose. Plus, if you die while carrying a block, that block gets destroyed in your inferno, and they don't respawn, so sometimes you may not be able to beat a level. This means any further lives you may have are useless. It's game over. You're shooting at stuff. Your bullets don't go straight, by the way, that would be too simple. And attempting to pick up and carry blocks, trying to protect your tank from blimps and turrets, while trying to control a broken plane, all of which is way harder than it should be, and you're trying to do it quickly and at the same time so that the tank doesn't blow up. This is without a doubt the most exhausting game I've ever played. You need to be caffeinated to the retinas to stand a chance. Unless you hate your brain, I'd stay as far away from Go-Go Tank as you can. Because all other poker is in 3D, right? Well, strictly speaking, I suppose it is, but I don't quite get the relevance of the game's spatial construct. Play it in 4 dimensions if you can figure out the continuum. As it happens, this isn't actually a poker game. No, this is a Tetris sort of experience, using the rules of hand building in poker. Cards are falling from the top of the screen into a 5x5 grid, and you have to create a poker hand out of them, either vertically or horizontally in groups of at least 3. You can have straights, flushes, straight and royal flushes, and 3 or 4 of a kind. The better the hand, the more points you get, and you progress to the next round if you can clear all the cards out. You have a hand of 4 cards that you can cycle through by pressing the B button, and holding A when the card is at the top of the screen keeps it held there for some valuable thinking time. Note that you only get a short countdown for this though, and once it's used up, it doesn't replenish. If you have any cards left over once the deck is done, then you lose 50 points per card. If your points total runs into negative, you're done. Seems logical. You start with 1,000 points, and for the first round you must ante 500 of those. To get past the first stage, either eliminate all the cards or get 500 points via the hands you put together. 3 of the same suit only gets you 10 points, but 3 of a kind, i.e. 3 nines, gives you a solid 300, and a straight flush of only 3 cards gives 500, so it's these you want to be going for. The payoff for just eliminating triplets isn't really worth it. Later on, you get replays that allow you to try a level again if you manage to beat it, but don't quite meet the ante or score too well. So at least it's not a one-loss game over type of thing. Beat a level and you get a rather sexy looking lady in a Bridget Jones style bunny outfit, and there's a sad looking clown girl if you lose and cannot continue. The visuals are drawn quite well, even if there aren't too many of them. There's also a 2-player mode where you take it in turns to place cards. This variation of the game is a lot of fun, and reminds me of the types of games we'd play with cousins when we visited the Gramps as kids. The opening music is a really grating rendition of SHMUP numéro 1 by Eric Satie, and the rest of the soundtrack is a pretty uninspiring assortment of other classical tunes. At the end of each stage, make sure you push A right away, else you're treated to this horrendous wailing noise until you do. I actually quite like this. It looks fine, and although it sounds pretty awful, you certainly don't lose anything by playing the game in silent. In fact, that's exactly how I would do it. The first French game adapted for the Game Boy is something of a strange one. You're a ghost in a haunted house. You'd think you'd be right at home there, but no. There are 35 rooms in this house that are laid out in a larger 6x6 cube, starting in the 5th right hall on the bottom row, going left to the edge, then up one. It then slaloms upwards until finally finishing in the upper right corner. The Game Boy level layouts are pretty faithful to the original Atari ST game, as are the gameplay mechanics. The ghost in the title has to propel his bubble from one side of a room to the exit on the other, around various obstacles such as spikes, candles, fans, and the walls themselves. Being a ghost, you can pass through anything unhindered and undamaged, but obviously that doesn't apply to the bubble. If it touches anything, it'll pop. The movement is momentum-based and quite clever. The closer you are to the bubble when you blow it, the faster and further it'll move. The ghost is easy to control. You can blow in 8 different directions, and as long as you're close to the bubble, you're automatically oriented towards it. For instance, if you're below and to the left of the bubble, the ghost will face upwards and right automatically. This really helps pull off the incredibly quick and precise actions you need. When I say precise, I really mean it. This game has absolutely pixel-perfect hit detection. Often that can be a detriment to 8-bit games, but in Bubble Ghost, it's an absolutely fantastic achievement that would be a detriment should it not be there. With a game so reliant on avoiding that one collision, having each pixel mean something is fantastic. Play this on a GBA with the backlight and you'll really appreciate what I mean. I find myself holding the Game Boy about 3 inches from my face because it's just that precise. Quite often there are ways to circumvent the obstacles. Trumpets can be blown into to turn off a fan, switches for electrical fields can be turned off, or candles blown out. Complete a level and you earn 4,000 points, plus there is a bonus meter at the bottom of the screen ticking down. If you complete the hall quickly, you get more of a bonus. 5 lives and 3 continues means plenty of opportunity to get to the end. Manage it and there's no final boss or anything, but the game doesn't need one. You blow your bubble out a window and you both float away into the sky. The music is part sprightly, part haunted house, and it really fits the theme. Graphically, everything's as cutesy as you'd expect, and the detail present in all the halls is excellent. Like I gushed about earlier though, the real achievement is just how exact everything is. The game may frustrate you a bit at first, but it's only because your skills aren't refined enough yet. Bubble Ghost never cheats you at all. A brilliant, unique, accomplished piece of work that everyone involved can be proud of. Just superb. Thanks so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts on the game down below, and if you can spare a second, give the review a quick thumbs up, it really helps out. Subscribe to the Portable Power Podcast for a new Game Boy review every day from Monday to Friday. Or alternately, new episodes of the podcast drop every Saturday and Sunday on whichever platform you get your pods. See you later on.